I trusted her. I thought she was family. Margaret had a way of making people believe she cared, that her concern was genuine. She would touch my arm during conversations, smile with a warmth that felt maternal, and insist that she only wanted the best for Daniel and me. So, when $300,000 disappeared from my husband's business account, I was blindsided when she pointed her perfectly manicured finger at me. "She stole it?" Margaret gasped, her voice quivering as if she were heartbroken. "I saw her messing with the finances. I didn't want to say anything at first, but she trailed off, shaking her head, as if she could barely bring herself to continue. Daniel's eyes darkened as he turned to me. "Emma." My heart pounded against my ribs. "Are you serious right now? You think I—" Margaret dabbed at non-existent tears with a silk handkerchief, her golden bracelet jingling with the movement. "I never wanted to believe it," she whispered. "But the numbers don't lie." That was all it took. A few well-placed words, a carefully constructed act, and suddenly, I was the villain. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't scream accusations. That would have been easier to fight. Instead, he withdrew, his love and trust retreating into the same place where his loyalty to his mother resided. His silence was worse than shouting. It was suffocating. The investigation began, the scrutiny, the doubt. Every glance in my direction felt like an unspoken accusation. I pored over financial statements, desperate to find proof of my innocence. But Margaret was meticulous. The trail was clean, except for the one she had left leading straight to me. Daniel moved out of our bedroom. My mother-in-law clucked sympathetically, painting herself as the suffering matriarch, caught between a lying daughter-in-law and her heartbroken son. Friends who once greeted me with warmth now hesitated before meeting my eyes. Whispers followed me. I hadn't taken a single cent, but truth didn't matter. Perception did. Margaret, on the other hand, was thriving. At first, I thought it was grief spending, some twisted way of coping. The expensive jewelry, the designer bags, the reservations at high-end restaurants. Then came the luxury car, the extravagant vacation to Europe, the subtle, smug smiles whenever she walked past me. She thought she had won. But secrets don't stay buried forever. And Margaret, for all her cunning, wasn't as untouchable as she believed. A year passed. A year of living under a cloud of suspicion. My reputation shredded by whispers and sideways glances. A year of Margaret basking in her stolen wealth, secure in the belief that she had framed me perfectly. And then, her cracks began to show. Daniel's company underwent an unexpected audit. Routine at first, but numbers don't lie, even when people do. Transactions flagged, anomalies exposed. A financial investigator assigned to the case, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. One document. That's all it took. Margaret's name, her signature, her lies, exposed in black and white. I didn't have to say a word. The moment Daniel saw it, his face lost all color. His mother, the woman he had defended, had stolen from him, from us, from the business he had built with his own hands. Margaret stammered, her carefully constructed facade cracking. "There must be some mistake," she choked out, reaching for Daniel's arm. "You know I would never." But the truth was right there, undeniable, irrefutable. And when the police got involved, she realized there was no escape. As they took her away, she looked at me. For the first time, her eyes weren't filled with triumph. They were filled with fear. I just smiled. "I guess you should have been more careful with the finances." And this time, no one doubted who the real thief was. Margaret's arrest should have been the end of it, the grand finale, the moment where justice prevailed, where I could finally breathe again, where Daniel would fall at my feet, begging for forgiveness. But real life isn't a neat little story with a satisfying resolution. The damage was already done. Dot, even with Margaret gone, her accusations had left their mark. My reputation wasn't magically restored overnight. People who had whispered about me for months didn't suddenly start singing my praises. Some still believed I had somehow been involved, that I had only managed to turn the tables on her before she could expose me further. Others just didn't care about the truth. And Daniel? He wasn't the same man anymore. Guilt gnawed him, sure. I could see it in the way he avoided my gaze, in the way his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his own stupidity had finally settled. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for me to forgive him. It wasn't enough to erase the nights I had spent crying myself to sleep, wondering if I had really been so naive to believe in love, in family and trust. Margaret might have stolen the money, but Daniel had stolen us, and I didn't think I could ever get that back. He tried. Oh, he tried. Apologies, long talks, promises that he had learned his lesson, that he would never doubt me again, that he had been stupid, blinded, wrong. I listened, arms crossed, my face unreadable. Let him pour his heart out. Let him feel the silence between us stretch longer and longer, until I finally spoke. It's not just about you believing her, Daniel. It's about what you let happen to me. You left me in that house with her. You let me be humiliated, treated like a thief. You didn't just believe her, you let her destroy me. His lips parted, but no words came, Dot, because there was no defense, no excuse, no fixing what he had broken. I wasn't sure when I had decided to leave. Maybe it had been the moment he moved out of our bedroom. Maybe it was when I saw Margaret parading around with her new car while I could barely show my face at a dinner party. Maybe it was when I realized that even after proving my innocence, I still felt like a stranger in my own life. That all I knew was that I was done. Dot. So when Daniel sat across from me one night, hopeful, desperate, waiting for some sign that we could mend what had been shattered, I gave him the only truth I had left. I don't love you anymore. And just like that, it was over. Dot Margaret had spent years weaving her web, trying to ruin me. In the end, she only ensured that I walked away, free. And for that, I almost wanted to thank her. Divorce should have been the next step. A clean break, a fresh start. But like everything else in this twisted saga, it wasn't that simple. Daniel didn't want to let go. Not because he was still in love with me, at least not in the way that mattered, but because he was desperate to undo the damage, to rewrite history, to make it so he hadn't spent a year treating me like a criminal, while his actual criminal of a mother drained his bank account dry. But reality doesn't work like that. I had already made up my mind, and no amount of apologies, gifts, or desperate pleas would change that. I had spent too long suffocating under the weight of his betrayal, too long feeling like I had to prove myself to a man who should have never doubted me in the first place. So I started the process. I filed the papers, I made arrangements, and then, like clockwork, the next problem arrived. Margaret. She was out. Not scot-free, of course. She'd been charged, humiliated, and left with nothing. But the legal system has a funny way of letting people like her slip through the cracks. A plea deal, a few technicalities, a reduction in her sentence due to cooperation. And just like that, she was back. I wasn't stupid. I knew she wouldn't come crawling to me with an apology. Margaret was many things, but remorseful wasn't one of them. She wasn't the type to admit defeat, not fully. And I was right. One day I found her waiting outside my building, dressed in muted tones, her face paler than I had ever seen it. For a moment, I just looked at her. The woman who had spent a year trying to bury me, the woman who had smiled while my life crumbled, the woman who had thought she had won. Now, she stood there. No designer clothes, no perfect makeup, no luxury accessories. Just Margaret, stripped down to the pathetic, manipulative core of who she really was. She opened her mouth. I cut her off before she could speak. I don't care, I said flatly. Whatever excuse you have, whatever nonsense you're about to spew, I don't care. A flicker of something crossed her face. Frustration, anger, maybe even fear. No, I interrupted. You don't just anything. You ruined my life, Margaret. And for what? Greed, spite? Just to see if you could? I let out a cold, humorless laugh. Well, congratulations. You did it, and look where it got you. She swallowed, her jaw tightening. I lost everything, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I tilted my head. So did I. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I turned, walked inside, and let the door shut behind me. Dot. She didn't follow. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. Margaret never showed up again. Whether it was shame, pride, or sheer self-preservation that kept her away, I didn't care. She'd already taken enough from me, my reputation, my marriage, my sense of security. Whatever scraps of her dignity she had left, she could keep them. Daniel, on the other hand, was harder to shake. Dot. Even after the divorce papers were filed, he kept trying. Not aggressively, not with anger or threats, just with this sad, pathetic persistence, texting me to check in, to remind me of the good times, to tell me he still loved me, still believed in us, that he wanted to fix what had been broken. But what he never understood, what he refused to understand, was that some things can't be fixed. Some betrayals don't heal. I stopped responding. Dot. It took months, but eventually he got the message. Dot. And that's when I really, finally started moving on. I rebuilt my life in pieces, one decision at a time. A new apartment, one that wasn't haunted by memories of whispered accusations and cold stares. A new job, one that gave me purpose beyond just surviving. New people, friends who had never doubted me, who had stood by my side when everything fell apart. For the first time in years, I felt free. Dot. And then, one night, I got a call. Dot. Not from Daniel, not from Margaret, but from an old acquaintance. Someone who had been on the fringes of our social circle, someone I barely spoke to anymore. I thought you should know, she said, her voice hesitant. Daniel's in trouble. I nearly laughed. What else is new? No, she pressed. It's bad. Let's just say he didn't handle the divorce well. That was an understatement. Dot. Turns out, after I left, Daniel unraveled. The guilt, the shame, the humiliation of realizing how deeply he had failed, it crushed him. He made bad choices, reckless financial decisions, drank too much, pushed away the people who tried to help. Dot. And then, worst of all, he let Margaret back into his life. Dot. Because of course he did. I should have felt something, pity, sadness, nostalgia for the man I once loved. But all I felt was exhaustion. I thanked her for telling me. Hung up. And then I went back to my life. Because Daniel wasn't my problem anymore. Dot. Margaret had ruined him, just like she had tried to ruin me. The difference was I survived. Dot. Months passed. Seasons changed. And with each passing day, Daniel and Margaret faded further into the background of my life. I thrived. I found joy in the simple things. Morning coffee on my balcony, the warmth of the sun on my skin, the quiet pleasure of a good book. I traveled, not to escape, but because I could. Because there was no one left to drag me down. No more accusations waiting in the shadows. No more betrayal hanging over my head like a storm cloud. Dot. And then, just when I thought the past had finally let me go, it clawed its way back in. Dot. It started with an email. Dot. Subject. Urgent. Please. I almost deleted it on sight. But something curiosity, irritation, that lingering instinct to check for loose ends, made me open it. Dot. It was from Daniel. Emma, comma. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but please, just hear me out. Things have gotten bad. really bad. I don't know who else to turn to. Please, just one conversation. I stared at the screen. Felt nothing, Dot. Then, comma against my better judgment, I replied, Dot, whatever it is, Daniel, it's not my problem. I expected silence, maybe another desperate plea. What I didn't expect was his next message. It's my mom. She's dying, Dot. That stopped me. Not because I cared, not because I had any sympathy left for Margaret, but because for the first time in years, I sensed something real in his words. Not manipulation, not an attempt to guilt me back into his life. Dot, just pure, raw desperation, Dot. And against all logic, all self-preservation, I picked up the phone, Dot. When he answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. Emma. I let the silence stretch, let him sit in it. Then, finally, talk. He exhaled shakily. She has cancer, late stage. There's nothing they can do. I didn't speak. She's not the same, he continued. She's lost everything. The money, the house. She's sick, alone, and she keeps asking for you. A humorless laugh escaped me. Of course she does. Emma, please. His voice cracked. He sucked in a breath. I don't know why I'm even calling. I just thought you should know. I closed my eyes. Is that all? Yeah. I ended the call, Dot. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not hate. Dot, just relief. Dot, Margaret was finally paying the price. I thought that was the end of it. Dot, that Daniel's call was just another ghost of the past, rattling its chains before disappearing forever. That Margaret's suffering was finally the universe settling the score. Dot, but fate wasn't finished with me yet. Dot, had happened a few weeks later. A knock on my door, soft but insistent, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure if they had the right to be there. I wasn't expecting anyone. Dot. And when I opened the door, the last person I ever thought I'd see again stood in front of me. Margaret. Dot. She looked awful. Gaunt, frail, her skin almost translucent under the harsh hallway lighting. Her once perfectly styled hair hung limp around her face, and her clothes, just a simple cardigan and slacks, looked like they belonged to someone else. Someone smaller, someone wasting away. I should have felt satisfaction. Should have reveled in the sight of her like this. Weak, diminished. A far cry from the woman who had once towered over me, pointing a manicured finger and accusing me of stealing from my own husband. Dot, but all I felt was disgust. Dot, not at her appearance. At her. The sheer audacity of her standing here, on my doorstep, as if we were old friends. I folded my arms. You're kidding. She swallowed, her throat bobbing. Emma. No. I shook my head. Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, no. She exhaled shakily. No. My voice was sharper this time. You don't get to just anything. You don't get to stand here and pretend like you're someone worth pitying. She flinched, and for a fleeting second, I thought she might turn around and leave. Dot, but Margaret had never known when to walk away. Dot, instead, she did something that nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. Dot, she dropped to her knees. Dot. Right there, in the hallway of my building, this woman, who had spent years making my life hell, who had stolen, lied, manipulated, collapsed at my feet like some fallen queen stripped of her crown. I have no one, she whispered. No one, Emma. I gritted my teeth. That's not my problem. She looked up at me, her eyes rimmed with something that might have been tears. I don't expect you to forgive me. Her voice was hoarse, hollow. I know I don't deserve it. But please, just listen. I should have walked away. Should have shut the door in her face. Let her rot in the mess she made. Dot. But some twisted, morbid part of me wanted to hear what she had to say. Dot. So I let her speak. Margaret knelt there, her frail hands trembling against the hardwood floor. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, like a shadow of the woman who had once dictated the terms of my life, the woman who had stolen my peace, my marriage, my dignity, Dot. And now she wanted something from me. Dot, she had nothing left to take. But still, I didn't trust her. I crossed my arms, my voice cold. You have 60 seconds. Use them wisely. She swallowed hard, like she knew this was the last sliver of grace I'd ever give her. I ruined everything, she whispered. I know that now. Her voice cracked, and for a second, I saw something raw in her face, something real. I wanted control. I wanted to protect Daniel from making a mistake, from... She trailed off, shaking her head. But I went too far. I didn't just hurt you. I destroyed him. I exhaled sharply. You didn't need to destroy me to protect your son. She closed her eyes for a long moment, then forced herself to look at me. But I did, because you were never the problem, Emma. I was. I stared at her, my heartbeat steady. I stole the money because I thought I deserved more, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I framed you because it was easier than admitting what I'd done. I let Daniel fall apart because I was too much of a coward to fix it. And now I have nothing left. She laughed bitterly. Not even time. Something in me twisted, but I shoved it down. So what do you want? I asked, refusing to let emotion seep into my voice. Dot. She hesitated, then softly, I don't want to die alone. The weight of her words settled between us like a dying ember, flickering in the dark. I should have felt triumphant. I should have let her beg, should have walked away and let her sit in the ruins of her own making. Dot. But I wasn't her. I would never be her. I sighed, the breath shaky in my chest. Get up. She blinked at me, confused. I'm not going to forgive you, I said firmly. I'm not going to play the role of the good, selfless woman who wipes the slate clean, but I'm also not going to be the monster you made me out to be. I stepped aside, motioning toward my apartment. You have one cup of tea, one conversation, and that's it. For the first time in her miserable, manipulative life, Margaret didn't argue. Dot. She just nodded, slowly climbed to her feet, and stepped inside Dot. And as I closed the door behind her, I realized this wasn't about her anymore. Dot, this was about me. Dot, reclaiming my story, my power, my choice. Dot. And Margaret, she was just the final chapter. Dot Margaret shuffled inside, her frail body moving with the stiffness of someone carrying too much weight, physically, emotionally, morally. I kept my distance, watching as she hesitated in the middle of my living room, taking in the space like she didn't quite believe she was here. Dot. She shouldn't be. I moved to the kitchen, filling the kettle with water, the quiet hum of it heating the only sound between us. I didn't offer her a seat, didn't offer her comfort. She didn't deserve it. You said you didn't want to die alone, I said, my back still to her. That's not really my problem, Margaret. A hollow laugh. I know. I turned, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. Then why are you really here? She met my gaze, her eyes sunken, dark with something beyond exhaustion. I wanted to see you, to tell you the truth, all of it. I frowned. The truth? You think I don't already know what you did? You don't know why I did it. I scoffed. Because you're a selfish, greedy... I was scared. That made me pause. Not because I believed her, but because fear was the last thing I ever associated with Margaret. She'd always been so certain, so ruthlessly in control. Dot. She let out a slow breath, her fingers twitching at her sides. You weren't the first woman Daniel loved. I stiffened. He was engaged before, she continued. Her name was Claire. They were young, reckless, and when he started building his business, she was right there beside him. a small, humorless smile. She was just like you, smart, independent, ambitious. A pit formed in my stomach. What happened? Margaret's face darkened. She betrayed him. I waited. She stole from him. From us. Nearly $500,000 vanished overnight. He never saw it coming. Her jaw tightened. And when she ran, she took his trust with her. I exhaled, my grip tightening around my own arms. Margaret shook her head. When Daniel met you, I thought, I hoped things would be different. But the more he loved you, the more I saw it happening all over again. I felt a sudden wave of nausea. So you made it happen? Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. I thought I was protecting him, that if I controlled the situation, if I forced the betrayal before it could happen naturally, at least I'd be the one pulling the strings. At least I'd know how it would end. I let out a bitter laugh. You destroyed him, she flinched. You took his last shred of trust and shattered it. You made him believe the one person who never would have hurt him was a thief, a liar. My voice rose. And for what? So you wouldn't have to face the possibility of being wrong. So you could sleep better at night knowing you were the puppet master? She swallowed, looking down. I know I failed him. And you. I can't change that. A pause. Then quietly. But I can admit it. The kettle whistled, sharp and piercing. I turned away, poured the water over a single tea bag, watching as the color bled into the water. My hands shook. I didn't know what to feel. Hatred? Pity? Indifference? All I knew was that Margaret wasn't here for redemption. She was here because she had nothing left. And for the first time, she was finally willing to see herself for who she truly was. The tea steeped, the amber color spreading through the water, slow and inevitable, like truth seeping through years of well-constructed lies. I didn't hand Margaret a cup. I just let it sit there, between us, like an offering neither of us was willing to claim. So what now? I asked, my voice flat. Margaret shifted on her feet, looking at the steaming cup before her as if it held the answer. I don't know. I let out a sharp breath, shaking my head. You always knew before. You always had a plan, a scheme. And now, when it's all gone, when there's nothing left to manipulate, you suddenly don't have an answer? She winced, but didn't argue. I let the silence stretch, let it fill the space between us with everything we weren't saying. Then, finally, I spoke again. Daniel still doesn't know you're here. A flicker of something in her face. Guilt, fear. No, she admitted. He wouldn't. I don't think he'd want to see me. You think? The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. After everything you did, after years of lies, of taking his trust and crushing it in your fists, you think he might not want to see you? I exhaled sharply. Margaret, he hates you. She closed her eyes, as if she could block out the weight of the words. And maybe, for the first time, she was realizing just how irreversible her destruction was. He loved you, I continued, my voice softer now. Even after everything, even when he thought I was the one who betrayed him, he loved you. I shook my head. And you made him regret it. Margaret's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked every bit like a woman who had finally realized the depth of her own ruin. I should have felt satisfaction, but all I felt was tired. I picked up the tea, walked past her, and opened the door. She stared at it. Go, I said. This conversation is over. Margaret hesitated, her gaze searching mine for something. Maybe forgiveness, maybe an ounce of softness. She wouldn't find it. Without another word, she stepped outside. I didn't watch her go. I just closed the door, Dot. And for the first time in years, I finally felt free. To the moment the door clicked shut, a strange stillness settled over me. I stood there for a long time, my fingers still curled around the doorknob, my heartbeat thrumming in my ears. Margaret was gone, really gone. No more schemes, no more manipulations, no more waiting for the next blow, Dot. And yet, I wasn't relieved, not entirely. I walked back into the kitchen, the untouched cup of tea still steaming on the counter. I stared at it, my mind spinning in circles, replaying every word she had said that Dot, you weren't the first woman Daniel loved. I had never heard that name before. Claire. He had never mentioned her, never hinted at an engagement, at a betrayal so deep it left scars I had unknowingly walked into Dot. Had he kept it from me because it hurt too much? Or had Margaret twisted the truth the same way she had twisted everything else? I didn't know, Dot. And that unsettled me more than anything, Dot. Because even after all this time, all the lies, all the damage, I still didn't know if I had all the truth. I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over Daniel's name in my contacts. A familiar hesitation gripped me. We had rebuilt so much. We had clawed our way back to something resembling trust, something that felt real again. Dot, did I really want to dig into old wounds? Would knowing the truth change anything? I exhaled, setting the phone down. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Dot instead, comma. I walked to the sink, poured out the tea, and watched as the dark liquid spiraled down the drain, Dot. Some things were better left buried, Dot. The next few days passed in a blur of normalcy that felt strangely hollow. I went through the motions, making breakfast, running errands, going to work. But there was an emptiness I couldn't shake. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that made you feel lost. No, it was the kind that made you realize how much of your life had been a lie, how much of yourself had been taken from you without your knowing, Dot. The silence in the house was suffocating at times. Daniel had been distant ever since the truth came to light. His eyes seemed clouded, like he was still trying to process everything. And I understood. I really did. What Margaret had done, what she had convinced him to believe about me. It wasn't something you could just shake off, Dot. But I also couldn't pretend everything was fine. Not anymore. I didn't have to wonder about whether Margaret had torn us apart. She had. She'd poisoned the roots of our marriage, and though we might have tried to salvage the branches, the damage to the foundation was irreversible. I needed space. Daniel needed time. And so I gave it to him. But every time I looked at him, I saw the distance between us. I could feel it, so sharp, like the space between two people standing on opposite sides of a vast chasm, unable to reach each other. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to scream at him, to demand that he see me, really see me again. But I didn't. Instead, I waited. I waited for him to decide whether he was going to choose me or whether I would always be the other woman in his eyes, the one who would cause the pain he couldn't forget. A week passed before Daniel finally broke the silence. It was late one evening when I came home from work to find him sitting on the couch, his face drawn and tired. He didn't look up as I entered, but his shoulders were tense, as though he was waiting for me to speak first. "Emma," he said, his voice low, like he hadn't used it in days. "We need to talk." I froze. Not because I didn't want to talk to him. I had spent every moment since Margaret's departure wondering when this moment would come, but because I wasn't sure I was ready for it. "Okay," I said, keeping my voice steady. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and regret. "I should have known," he began, shaking that head slowly. "I should have never believed her. But I did. I chose to trust my mother, And in doing so, I hurt you. I hurt us. I swallowed hard, but I didn't speak. I don't know why I let her do it, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to believe that everything was okay, that it was you who had betrayed me. But deep down, I knew I was just making excuses for her. And when I found out the truth, he trailed off as if unable to finish the thought. I sat down beside him, careful not to touch him just yet. Daniel, my voice cracked a little. I can't change what happened. I can't take back the pain that's been caused. But I need to know. I paused, trying to keep my composure. Do you still love me? He turned to face me then, his eyes wide, as if he hadn't expected me to ask that question. Of course I do. I always have. My chest tightened. Then why did you let her tear us apart? Why did you let me become the person you couldn't trust? His eyes softened, filled with shame. Because I was scared, Emma. I was scared of losing her, losing my mother. I thought if I could just make you the villain, if I could make you the one who betrayed me, then I wouldn't have to face the truth. The truth that she was the one who stole from me, from us. I closed my eyes, letting the words settle over me. The pain, the years of doubt, the feeling of betrayal. It was all starting to make sense. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I need time, I said quietly. I need time to forgive you and to forgive myself. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with remorse. I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I need you to know. I never meant to hurt you. Not like this. I reached for his hand, feeling the weight of what we had been through. I know, I whispered, but I need more than promises now. I need action. I need to see that you're willing to fight for us, that you're willing to fight for me. He squeezed my hand, his grip firm but gentle. I will, Emma. I swear. I'll fight for you. I'll do whatever it takes. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before Dot Margaret had taken so much from us. But what she hadn't taken, what she could never take, was the chance to rebuild, to make things right again, Dot. And maybe, just maybe, Daniel and I had a shot at it. Dot, but it wasn't going to be easy. It would take time. It would take patience. It would take trust, the very thing that had been shattered between us, Dot. And yet, despite everything, I believed we could find our way back, Dot. Not because we were perfect, but because we had learned the hardest lesson of all, Dot, that trust, once broken, could be mended if only we were willing to face the truth. Dot, the truth about Margaret, the truth about ourselves, and the truth about love, Dot. It wasn't the ending I'd expected, but it was the one we needed. Dot, Emma had changed. After everything, the betrayal, the lies, the years of doubt, she no longer felt like the victim. The pain had pushed her to a place of clarity, a place where vengeance wasn't about an eye for an eye, but about the restoration of her dignity, her life, and her future. She had spent too long being silent, too long waiting for others to right the wrongs done to her. Now, she was taking charge, but not out of anger, out of necessity. She wasn't just fighting for revenge. She was fighting for peace. Margaret, on the other hand, was still wrapped up in her web of lies, believing she could continue her manipulations without consequence. She had everything: money, power, a son who, until recently, had blindly trusted her. But now, as the walls closed in on her, she could feel the pressure mounting. She didn't understand what was happening, how everything she had worked for was slipping from her grasp. All her money, her luxury, her arrogance. It was all about to crumble. Daniel stood behind Emma, a man torn between loyalty and truth. He wasn't perfect, and his actions had hurt Emma deeply, but now, in this moment, he was on her side. He had seen through his mother's lies, understood the damage she had caused, and now He was ready to make things right. The stage was set. The final confrontation was inevitable. Emma had known from the start that she would need more than just her word to prove the truth. Margaret's deceit had been too vast, too intricate, but Emma had bided her time, letting the evidence pile up, knowing that one day it would all come crashing down. And now, with a final audit and the investigation's damning conclusion, the moment had arrived. She sat quietly as the news broke. Margaret's name was plastered across the headlines. Her extravagant spending habits, her false transactions, her attempts to hide the stolen money. They were all exposed. The truth came out like a flood, and there was no escaping it. Margaret, desperate to protect herself, tried to deflect the blame onto Emma one last time. But this time, there was no one left to believe her. Daniel, his face pale with realization, stood beside Emma, watching his mother's world unravel. For the first time, he didn't try to defend her. Margaret's assets were frozen. Her business dealings were scrutinized, and before she knew it, her financial empire was in ruins. Her friends, once loyal, distanced themselves. Even her closest allies turned their backs when the truth became too damning to ignore. When the police arrived at her doorstep, Margaret's once imposing confidence shattered. There was no escape this time. She was arrested, her wealth seized, and her reputation destroyed. The woman who had once manipulated everything and everyone, including her own son, was now the subject of public scorn. Emma didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The look on her face was enough. She had won. The day Margaret was taken away in handcuffs, Emma didn't feel the rush of triumph she had expected. She didn't feel glee or satisfaction. Instead, there was a quiet relief, the kind you experience when a storm finally passes. It wasn't over, not yet, but the worst of it was, Daniel stayed by her side, apologizing for his blindness, for the years he had wasted defending a lie. And though Emma couldn't erase the pain, she realized that this moment, this victory over the darkness that had consumed her life, was hers alone to claim. No one could take that away from her. Not Margaret. Not even Daniel. They moved away from the city, away from the memories of betrayal, of deceit, and settled into a quieter life. The constant tension that had once hung over their marriage began to dissipate, piece by piece. Emma still didn't know if she could fully trust Daniel again, but they had a chance. That was all she needed. Time, space, and the freedom to rebuild. A's for Margaret. She was left alone in the wreckage of her own making. Her former allies turned against her. The wealth and luxury she had once flaunted were now gone. The fame she had built with lies had crumbled into ruin. Her name, once associated with power, now carried only shame. Months later, when Emma had started to find peace again, she received a message, an email from a blocked address. She opened it slowly, expecting nothing more than another reminder of the past. But the words that filled the screen were different this time. They were from Margaret. "I've lost everything, my wealth, my name, my son. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could control it. I thought I could control you." Emma read the message once, then twice, letting it sink in. Then, with a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips, she typed a single response. "You thought you could control me, but you never understood who I really was." She pressed send and closed her laptop, leaning back in her chair. A weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying lifted from her chest. There was no need to keep dwelling on the past. There was no need to dwell on Margaret. The truth had come out. Justice had been served. And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she could finally breathe. "Some people never learn," she muttered to herself, standing up to leave. "But I guess that's their problem now." The door closed behind her, and for the first time in years, she stepped into the world. unburdened, ready for whatever came next.